You and me go fishing in the dark, lying on our backs and counting the stars. Salmon are members of the subfamily Salmoninae, and salmon are really interesting fish. They're probably among the most famous fish for us. I think outside of sharks they are. And salmon are medium to large sized predatory fish that spend most of their life at sea, feeding on things like smaller fish, krill, shrimp. They're pretty opportunistic. However, more famously, they spend part of their life in freshwater. Salmon will hatch and generally live in fresh and brackish water for most of their young lives until they get big enough to go out to sea, where they'll spend most of their lives and they will swim back upstream to the streams where they were born to reproduce. That's probably the most famous thing about salmon, and I'll talk about that obviously more. I mean, you know I'm going to talk about that. But salmon are really interesting. And there's two main types of salmon as far as we're concerned, and those are the Atlantic and the Pacific salmon. They're not technical species. There's actually a lot more different species of Pacific salmon than there are Atlantic, but there are clear differences. The main difference, I would say, is the fact that Atlantic salmon, when they travel upstream, don't actually die. Pacific salmon, by and large, all die when they travel upstream, and that's the thing that's most famous about them, and hence why Pacific salmon are probably more iconic than Atlantic salmon, I would say. They basically do the same thing. They all travel upstream using a pretty keen sense of direction. It seems to be more olfactory based than any sort of memory, and it's been suggested that they've actually got some sort of magnetism in their brains, which allows them to home in exactly the same place where they were born. And they obviously all go on these really epic migrations upstream, which is already really impressive because they're going upstream against the flow of water. Like, that's not an easy thing to do. And you get the iconic images of salmon, you know, jumping waterfalls to get upstream, and it's that really iconic thing about salmon that's made us really respect and admire them. And the fact that they go upstream, and obviously in the case of Pacific salmon they'll die, it's obviously this really iconic and kind of romanticised thing. They're basically swimming upstream to reproduce, lay their eggs. This most epic of journeys ultimately costs them their lives. And Pacific salmon, when they get upstream, always change their shape, especially the males. They've got those kind of grotesque features, their jaws kind of extend, they've got these fangs they develop. It's really weird. Obviously the more time they spend upstream in freshwater, the more readily they kind of start decomposing when they're alive. It's pretty horrific. You get salmon that look like almost like zombies. Pretty grim, but that salmon migration is extremely important, not just for us, because we obviously find it really iconic and it obviously benefits us, and I'll talk about that, but it's really beneficial to a lot of animals and the surrounding environment. So salmon are a primary food source during that migration period for things like orcas, eagles, seals, bears most famously, and in fact, grizzly bears in the Pacific Northwest of North America pretty much exclusively feed on salmon within that period. At least in the Pacific, they're really vital for the ecosystem as well. Salmon are considered to be keystone species of that environment, and unlike a lot of other keystone species, things like elephants and beavers that pretty much engineer their environment in a deliberate way, salmon are really able to influence the environment pretty much after they die. Because so many of them die in this one area, they provide a significant amount of nutrients to the surrounding forest, which is part of the reason that the rainforests in that part of the world are so nutrient rich, and it's pretty much down to the salmon, and the forest would not be what it is without them. And salmon have been really important for us, and they've basically appeared in our mythology wherever they've been. Salmon were very important for Celtics and for Native Americans in North America, and we've pretty much always suspected that salmon travelled to the place where they were born. It's a rare case where mythology has actually been proven correct by science, and salmon are very important to us for a number of reasons today, because salmon are really important for fishing. So our perception of salmon is very much influenced by that notion of them being the sort of king of the fish, going on this really epic migration, this really epic journey, which ultimately culminates in their death, by and large, at least for Pacific salmon. Fishing is a pretty lucrative industry. Salmon fishing in particular is particularly lucrative. There's a lot of money goes towards it here in Scotland, even more so in places like Canada. Places like Campbell River in British Columbia pretty much thrive on the money that salmon fishing brings in, tourism-wise. And the idea of catching salmon is kind of a footnote in man's struggle against nature, man's conquering of nature. The fact that we can catch this really epic fish, the king of fish, feeds into our perception of us versus nature and us taming and conquering nature. But salmon are also very good for eating. Salmon are notoriously tasty. In fact, all over the world people eat salmon, whether that be sushi in Japan or here in Britain. We pretty much all like to eat salmon. Salmon's pretty good. That really iconic pink tinge that salmon has ultimately comes from the way they feed out at sea, similarly to the way that flamingos turn pink due to the pigment of their food. Because salmon eat a lot of krill, their flesh turns pink. It's a really weird thing. They're high in omega-3 acids, which are really good. A portion of salmon is basically as filling as a portion of beef is, but you've not got the added risk of heart disease. So salmon's seen as a pretty good alternative to that. And because they taste so good, and because we know they're healthy, they've become a pretty desirable food source. Much as in the case of all commercial fishing, going out to sea to catch loads of salmon, or catching them when they travel upstream in mass, is just not very sustainable. And ultimately it would just destroy the populations. And salmon populations are not doing very well for a number of reasons. Part of that's fishing, part of that's climate change, a big part of that's climate change, to be honest. It's ultimately the vast majority of salmon we eat, in fact 99% of it, is actually farmed. And it's interesting to note that only Atlantic salmon are farmed. Even in the Pacific, it's Atlantic salmon that have been transported there for the purposes of farming. And salmon farming is pretty controversial. Basically, all the salmon are kept in this really enclosed space, kind of like battery farm chickens. They're basically kept there for the vast majority of their lives. It's very controversial because it's seen as pretty unethical. It's not really great as far as welfare is concerned. A lot of these salmon are very prone to diseases. They get things like lice. It's not uncommon to see them actually rotting just because they've got so many parasites. It's pretty horrific. Their flesh tends not to naturally develop that really iconic pink pigment, so they're generally treated with chemicals. Actually feeding all these salmon is also an issue. Because salmon are predators, they feed on other fish. They've generally got to go out, catch smaller fish to feed to the salmon, which also isn't very sustainable. Failing that, they're fed on soy, which is also extremely damaging to the environment to farm. So there's actually no real sustainable way of actually farming salmon. And considering the vast majority of the salmon in the world are actually domesticated salmon, it's pretty ironic that we have this notion of them as being this really wild, ultimate fish that goes on this really epic journey and is a true symbol of strength and magnificence in the natural world. The fact that we've basically subjected them to an animal that spends its entire life in a stationary position, basically swimming in its own shit for its entire life in a really horrific conditions, is a bit ironic, and it's actually really depressing, I find. So yeah, salmon, to summarise, are really cool. They're really interesting. We know that. We've always liked salmon. So that really iconic journey they go on is, you know, among the most iconic stories in nature. I would say it's probably up there with the wildebeest migration. It might even be more iconic to us in the northern hemisphere than that, but we still want to go out and catch them because it's seen as the ultimate dream for any fisherman. But ultimately, by and large, we've taken this really impressive fish, this really iconic animal that goes on one of the most impressive journeys in nature, and we've turned it into essentially a vegetable. We generally talk a lot about mammal and bird welfare when it comes to domesticated animals, but we don't tend to extend that quite so much to fish. And because salmon are an animal that we really admire and is really impressive to us, maybe we should, you know, care more about them. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you thought of this video. What do you think of salmon? Have you got any salmon stories? I've seen the salmon run here in Scotland and in Canada. Most impressively, seeing the bears catching the salmon was just an incredible thing to see. If you ever get the chance to do that, it's definitely worth doing it. It will not disappoint you. It's really cool. But yeah, if you've got any salmon stories or if you've seen that, let me know. And yeah, let me know what you'd like me to talk about in future. Obviously, I've got a list, but if you give me recommendations, it bumps them up and I might talk about them next. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment and subscribe, or don't if you don't want it. It's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.